Chapter 1. The Forest of Dane, capital of Drayden. Round 2305, 20th Pass. The creature landed on the branch of the shade and folded its 3 pairs of wings. Its body, almost a hand in length, shone iridescent in the warm light of Lakai, flickering from cyan to magenta and back again as it turned. Caught in its mouthparts was the struggling form of a smaller black insect. Kiri watched, fascinated as the flit rapidly and efficiently consumed the unfortunate Narg, enjoying the swift and fierce dismemberment of the prey, seeing its legs twitch impotently as it died, accompanied by a faint but delicious squelching and cracking sound. Flits were a rare sight in these parts, usually only found in the Shadeward. The weather had been somewhat cooler of late, encouraging the pretty creatures into the shade forests around the city. She carefully lowered a brace of marsips to the ground, licking her lips in anticipation of cooking them later. She approached cautiously, moving slowly to stay as quiet as possible. As she crept amongst the tall straight trunks, she dislodged streams of condensation from the thin curtain-like filaments that hung down from the branches around her. She brushed it out of her eyes. Sunlight filtered through in bright red majestic beams of light from the canopy overhead. Far above, the outstretched cups of the shades fought for dominance against each other, each one struggling for position, a silent, desperate and eternal battle to secure precious light and water. A faint mist hovered between their trunks. Kiri turned, put her finger to her lips and beckoned to her companion, who likewise lowered a series of strung-up marsips to the ground and crept forward. Hunting in the forests of Dane was illegal, but all the Onlys did it. It was the only way to supplement their food supply. Stealing from traders in the city brought you quickly to the attention of the guards. It had to be done sparingly. They dared not go too far into the forest. Stranger creatures lived within, and there were other hazards too. It wasn't just the animals you had to concern yourself with. There were many traps for the unwary. Sand and bogs featured aplenty, and according to some of the more wild accounts, there were even plants that took a fancy to flesh. The flit, unconcerned with their stealthy approach, quickly finished its meal. Nothing was wasted. Even the extremities of the Narg were consumed. The flit turned and seemed to be looking at them. Kiri wondered how she appeared to the gaze of those 3 tiny faceted eyes, set like sapphires in the creature's angular head. Small wonder flits were admired when their eyes looked like jewels. Kiri was entranced. Funny how all the animals had 3 eyes, and her kind only had 2. Without making a sound, she managed to get within a few hands of the creature and paused there, bracing herself against a shade trunk, watching it. "Isn't it pretty?" her companion whispered in delight. "I've never seen one so close." Tia had been Kiri's companion for many rounds. Kiri had found her after her parents had died in one of the plagues that occasionally beset their lands. Just a child, Kiri had looked after her, teaching her how to survive in a city that neither wanted nor acknowledged their existence. Onlys, unseen, scraping a living via theft and cunning. Kiri smiled briefly, admiring the beautiful, delicate creature. The flit remained unmoved for a moment, before Kiri saw its antennae rise up as if sensing something. A moment later she too heard a noise. People, somewhere close. Surprised and annoyed, she looked over her shoulder, searching amongst the trunks. She couldn't see anyone, but voices were getting louder. She cursed under her breath. The flit extended its wings, 1 pair at a time, the forewings low, the centre pair held horizontal, with the final rear pair held high. It was poised, ready to fly. "No, don't go," Kiri whispered. Voices were loud, accompanied by the crashing sounds of clumsy footsteps trampling vegetation underfoot. Guffaws and giggles shattered the quiet of the forest. The flit's wings disappeared in a flurry of movement, and it spiralled upwards, disappearing into the canopy. Kiri turned as a group of 3 boys barged into the small clearing. It was a group of brothers from the city. She had seen them before. "Watch your shadow, you snuts!" she called out. In their haste, the boys hadn't noticed Kiri and Tia until almost walking into them. The younger 2 stumbled back against the shades in fright at her sharp glare. The other boy was bigger, stronger and less intimidated. Choso. Kiri could see he was carrying a wooden sword, his hand resting protectively on the hilt. It was no toy, but a practiced weapon, properly weighted and balanced. Tia caught sight of the sword and sidled behind Kiri, holding her arm nervously. "What are you doing here, slums?" Choso said, sizing them up, spying the sets of dead marsips on the ground. "Hunting again? Against the law, as you've been told before." "Look to your own shade," Kiri retorted. "Might ask you the same thing. We were here first." "You can't order us about," one of the smaller ones said impulsively. "You're not a priestess or a guard." "Not yet," Kiri fired back, "but I will be. And then when you displease me, I'll drag you to the temple, cut out your heart and eat it in front of you. Slash, squish, yum." She mimed stabbing the small boy with a knife, licking it and then wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Kiri laughed as the boy cringed in fear and yelped. Choso pushed in front of him defensively. "You won't be a priestess," he sneered. "You've got no line. You've got to be noble. Everyone knows that." "Don't need one," Kiri retorted, facing off against him. She was a head shorter than the chunkier boy. Kiri felt Tia's warning tug on her arm. "Kiri, let's go. We can find other food," the smaller girl pleaded. Kiri pulled herself free. "I'll be scorched before I give up my prey on account of this snut." She stared up fiercely into Choso's grey eyes, ignoring the short blonde hair, muscular arms and stocky torso before her. Tia backed away, leaving Kiri facing Choso alone. Kiri could tell Choso wasn't used to the only standing up against him. She'd seen him intimidate others. It wasn't going to work on her, even if his mother was captain of the temple guard. He had never cornered her before. The other onlys always fled like the marsips at the first sign of trouble. Not her. She defied and taunted the rich family children, letting them chase her down streets to get caught in her ingenious traps, perhaps piles of refuse cunningly rigged to fall, or a pack of starving rabid Khans. She saw Choso run his eyes over her thin and lanky frame, topped by an unruly matted crop of grimy black hair tied up on her head with a dirty cord. He grimaced at her filthy skin and tatty mix of stolen clothing, only then meeting the gaze of her fierce blue eyes. Kiri had been chased around the city, always skulking, stealing food brazenly from the traders. She knew Choso's mother had been tasked with clearing the streets of her and the rest of the illegal youngsters. Most of the time it appeared she'd largely succeeded. Kiri and the others like her raided the city during the sleeping. Where they went other times had always been a secret. Not any longer. Life was going to get even harder now that Choso knew where they hid. "Be thinking you can fight your way in then, slum?" Choso laughed, poking her with an outstretched finger. He walked around her, and she stood still defensively, looking at him as he paced. "You wouldn't last a spell in the arena." "I could beat you now, city mulch," Kiri snapped back, spinning around to face him. Choso pushed her hard and she stumbled backwards, losing her footing. Before she could react, he'd grabbed her tunic at the scruff of the neck and hauled her to her feet, roughly pushing her onto the smooth trunk of the nearest shade. It hurt, and she grimaced. She felt her feet dangling in the air. The sword was in his other hand, pointing at her face. She grabbed at the arm holding her, unable to move it, struggling against his superior strength. He lowered her to the ground, but kept the sword at her face. Kiri heard Tia screech in fear. The other two brothers laughed. "Learn her, Choso," one shouted. Choso grinned in response. "I'm thinking you need to know your place, slum," he said, jabbing her cheek with the point of his sword and jolting her back against the shade. It might have only been a wooden sword, but it hurt like fury. She could feel hot blood dripping down her cheek and neck. Her eyes narrowed. "I do," she whispered under her breath. Choso frowned, leaning in closer to hear her, wrinkling his nose at the odour rising from her dirty clothes. She brought her knee up as hard as she could, driving it into Choso's unprotected crotch. He screamed, letting her go and dropping his sword. As he leant forward, Kiri punched him directly into the throat with a short, sharp yell. Choso's cries were choked off and he fell to his knees. Kiri kicked him over with an outstretched foot. She backed away, standing next to Tia. "Told you." Choso was trying to gasp out some words. She couldn't make them out. His brothers were at his side, trying to help him stand. Choso struggled to make himself heard, howling out his pain and indignation. Kiri caught his stare as he managed to look up with murderous intent, his face suffused with anger, bright red and sweating, desperately trying to regain his feet. He croaked out something. His brothers didn't understand and leant in closer. Kiri caught the next words. "Get them!" Choso panted out, furiously impotent. Kiri looked around at Tia. The small girl was quaking with fear, her eyes wide. Kiri motioned with her eyes. Tia nodded. Kiri turned her attention to the boys. The next youngest brother picked up the sword and stepped towards her. Kiri circled back. The boy swung clumsily at her head and she ducked, the wooden sword striking the bark of a shade with a dull thud, showering her in splinters. Kiri jumped aside, only to be blocked by the other brother. He swung a punch at her, which she narrowly avoided. Then there was a gap between them. "It took us a long spell to catch those marsips." "Now!" she yelled to Tia. The other girl disappeared into the undergrowth as fast as the marsips they'd been pursuing. Kiri ran too, following in the direction Tia had fled. They had a head start, and both were good runners. You didn't last long as an only if you couldn't run. Unfortunately, the boys behind her were equally fast, and after gaining a little of a head start, Kiri could sense she wasn't outrunning them. They were better fed. They could last longer. She lurched between the shade trunks, looking for the easiest way forward, legs pounding with exertion, outstretched branches whipping painfully past her. She paid them no heed. Aching pain rose up her loins. She couldn't keep this up. She heard an abrupt shriek ahead. Before she could stop, she ran too quickly up a rise, came to a damp outcrop, lost her footing and slid down the other side, smearing herself in mud and winding herself as she hit the bottom, rolling onto her front. Tia was already sprawled in the mud before her. She saw the two brothers reach the top of the rise and make the same mistake. They came crashing down alongside her. Kiri jumped unsteadily to her feet, struggling for breath, panting hard. Tia seemed to have been badly winded by the fall. She only managed to get to her knees, gasping for breath. Kiri spied a sturdy branch on the ground and grabbed it, brandishing it in front of her, stepping between Tia and the pursuers. The two brothers circled her warily, preventing her from leaving. Both were now grinning at her predicament. Choso appeared at the top of the bank and awkwardly swung himself down, still gasping in pain. "You're proper droughted now," he said with a grimace, his voice rough. Kiri watched as he grabbed the wooden sword from the brother to his right. He swung it experimentally. He seemed to know what he was doing. The sword whistled as it passed through the air. The other two brothers circled behind her. Kiri raised her branch in defence, sidestepping and trying to keep them away from Tia. "Tia!" she hissed, from between clenched teeth, unable to spare a glance down at her companion. All she could hear was the poor girl gasping and wheezing. Maybe she was hurt. Kiri had no idea whether Choso had received any real training in the use of a sword, but she was painfully aware she had none. She had heard tell that a barbarian from Drem in the Shadeward had once knocked the head of a slave clean off with nothing but a wooden sword. Maybe it was true. It wouldn't do to underestimate it. She kept her eyes focused on the sharp tip as Choso waved it about. She saw his eyes flicker from right to left, and sensed rather than felt the two brothers closing in on her. Quick as a flash, she spun, dealing both of them a sharp whack to the head with her branch. Both yelled and fell backwards. Choso's yell brought her attention back, and she raised her branch in defence just quick enough to block a blow to her torso that would have easily broken a rib. Her arms trembled as she deflected the impact, the branch vibrating painfully in her hands. Choso turned and swung his sword down on her, aiming for her head. Again she blocked it. Choso twisted the sword in a peculiar way, and Kiri found the branch wrenched from her hands. It splattered into the mud a few hand-lengths away. Choso didn't hesitate. Kiri saw the tip of the sword swing towards her unprotected chest. She instinctively threw up her hands, but it was too late. "No!" Kiri felt herself jolted aside, away from the deadly thrust of Choso's sword. Choso yelled, driving the sword forward. Kiri fell into the mud, rolling, trying to turn her head to see. She heard a sharp impact, a gasp that turned into a horrid gurgle. Eyes, widening in horror and pain, caught her own in realization. Hands that spasmed uncontrollably, knees that buckled. Redness, stillness, too much redness. A pounding in her ears, rage and anger at the merciless of the world. Choso pulled his sword back abruptly, his mouth falling open in shock and dismay. Tia fell to the ground. lying on her back, staring into the forest canopy. Kiri ran to her, heedless of the danger. "Tia!" The girl's face was pale, her breath bubbling red in her mouth. Blood trickled out. She choked, trying to say something, her body convulsing. Her hands flailed around for a moment before Kiri grasped them tightly. There was blood everywhere. Tia's eyes looked into Kiri's in terror before their gaze suddenly froze, looking past Kiri, sightless and empty. Her body was abruptly still. Kiri found she was shaking and unable to stop herself. How long she was immobile she wasn't sure, but the cracking of a twig on the ground nearby brought her back to the present. She looked up, seeing Choso slowly stepping towards her, his sword stained with blood. Tia's blood. "Didn't mean to," Choso stammered. "I was only trying to scare you." Kiri's face was suffused with rage. She looked up furiously. "Murderer!" Tears streaked her face, burning hot. She let go of Tia's hands, hating the way her arms dropped lifelessly into the mud. She caught sight of a branch and grabbed it, brandishing it in front of her and stalking towards Choso. Choso backed away from the incensed expression on her face, but she closed with him. "Enough, slum, or I'll do the same to you," he stammered. Kiri was oblivious. She swung viciously at Choso. He only just managed to deflect the blow. Kiri attacked again, swinging wildly with the branch, screaming out her injustice on the figure of hate before her. She beat him down, her strength mindless and irresistible. Choso stumbled, losing his footing. She raised the branch, aiming a blow at his head, aiming to kill if she could. Pain flashed up her calf. In a rage she'd forgotten the other two brothers. One had grabbed another branch and struck her with it. Her leg gave way, sprawling her into the mud. The three boys moved to surround her. "Hit her again!" Choso shouted. "Kill her!" The brother who had struck backed away, shaking his head. "I ain't doing it, not killing." Choso cursed at him. "If she tells what we've done, you think it would go well with us? Murdering and all? Kill her! No one need know. No one cares about these snutting slums." "I ain't doing it," the brother repeated, and stepped back again. Kiri spared Tia's forlorn and lifeless body another glance, summoning what little resolve remained to her. Blood. Shocking instant death. She staggered to her feet, pushed past the undecided brother and fled again, lurching away, trying to force her mind to work, survival the only consideration now. "Get her!" She heard Choso's yell of anger and could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind, hounding her, yelling curses as they tried to overtake. She couldn't run as well as before. A large bruise had already broken out on the leg where she'd been hit, and it stung like a nag bite. There was no way she could be stealthy either, no way she could stop them from following. They were gaining, like a pack of Khans chasing down a wounded herd. Ahead, the forest was thinning. She was nearly back to the suburbs. She leapt over a series of low bushes and burst out onto the dry and dusty lane that led around the city, blinking in the bright sunlight after the gloom of the forest. In front of her was the exposed side of a house, serving as a natural wall to the road. She skidded to a halt, almost falling as she stopped close to the wall and quickly considered her options. She didn't have long to think. Choso and one brother emerged to her right, with the other brother coming out on her left, blocking the lane. She'd have no chance in a close-quarters fistfight. "Tia! Oh, Tia!" Redness swamped her vision again. The horrible sound of the sword echoed through her mind. The blood was still slick on her fingers. She could smell it in her nostrils. Tia's body impaled, sliding to the ground. Kiri shook her head. "Concentrate. They're going to kill you next." Choso began patting the blade of the sword against his other palm and stalked slowly towards her. "Enough of your furling, slum," he said, his voice menacing. "Gonna beat you like the Khan you are." "Better a Khan than a dung-hog like you, murdering snut," she replied bitterly, looked up, and jumped. The wall was higher than an average adult, but she caught the top of it with one hand, swinging precariously for a moment before securing her opposite elbow and levering herself up, her dirty, bare, calloused feet clawing for grip against the sandy rocks of the wall. The rough rock cut at her hands and feet, but there was nothing she wasn't used to. Choso and his brothers pushed forward to grab her, but she slipped out of reach, standing up on the wall and tiptoeing along it, taunting them with curses, still holding her branch. From the wall, the tiled roof of the house led up and away from the road. The brothers began to throw pebbles and stones at her, so she scrambled up the roof, delicately treading along the stone guttering to get out of range. It was a large house, with a series of verandas that overlooked the forest behind her. She was able to jump up to the next one and continued climbing until she reached the highest level. Behind the house was a series of similar buildings. It wouldn't be hard for her to find a place to hide. She heard a curse and looked back to see Choso climbing the wall behind her. She watched as he slipped a couple of times before he managed to get to the top, accompanied by the cheers of encouragement from his brothers. He began to head towards her. Kiri deftly made her way around the edge of the veranda she was on and came to a point above the street on the other side. For a moment she gasped. Before her the city rose, houses first, increasingly more ornate as they approached the centre, marked by rising plumes of smoke from chimneys. Beyond that, the grander buildings of the city courts could be seen, spires and towers reaching for the sky, some clad in precious metals, sparkling in the warm light of Lakai. Her eyes were drawn to the centre immediately. Beyond the houses and the spires was a vast pyramid, smooth-sided and austere compared with the more baroque architecture around it, built of smooth redstone. It dominated the view, contrasting sharply with the lighter stone of the other buildings. Kiri had heard that the interior was paved in metal, but found it hard to believe such a wonder could really be true. Metal was just too precious. There was the abode of the priestesses. No men were allowed inside, so it was said. She could just make out a few daks, flying reptiles bearing mounted riders from the temple, circling in the air, carrying messages and news from lands afar. Kiri watched for a moment as one slowed above the temple, its wings back flapping to slow its approach. What must it be like to fly such a creature? Only the priestesses and their chosen acolytes knew. Around the temple was a large piazza, cleared and empty now. Kiri had skulked around it during the celebration days, seeing the priestesses parade in their fancy gowns and pageantry. It was there that the arena was set up, and women from all around Drayden would be summoned, some to gain a place amongst the priestesses. Most failed, of course. You could never tell who was going to be chosen. Sometimes the most unlikely entrants made it through. Some of the challenges were strange and unusual, so it was told. Another celebration was due before too long, perhaps another pass or so. Kiri sighed. One day I'll get my chance. A sound from behind her alerted her that Choso had gained the roof. She looked forward and down, ignoring the dazzling view. It was only then she realised she had miscalculated. The road had dropped away on the far side of the house, leaving her with a drop that sent her reeling backwards when she peered over the edge. There was no way down. The next house was smaller than it had appeared and on the opposite side of the road. It was too far to jump, even for her. Choso appeared around the edge of the roof. Trapped, she watched as he made his own way along the guttering, clearly conscious of the long fall below. He had to bend down to steady himself with one hand as he crept towards her. His body was almost in complete silhouette, framed against a huge ruddy orb of Lakai hanging in the sky behind him. Kiri looked about desperately for another way to escape, but the only route was back the way she had come, a route now guarded by the furious bulk of Choso, still moving towards her. She turned and raised a branch in her hand, her eyes widened. She was suddenly conscious of her heart beating fast in her chest, accompanied by a buzzing in her ears. She heard the sound of scuttering feet in the dust far below, and realised the other two brothers had found their way around the wall and were looking up at the altercation from below. Moments later, taunts and abuse were hurled in her direction along with encouragement for Choso. Choso took a couple of practised swings with his sword, all the time adjusting his balance on the sloping roof. Kiri braced herself. "Gonna end you now, slum," Choso said, licking his lips, a grin twisting his features. Below, the brothers continued to yell encouragement to him. Kiri spat at him and stabbed out with a branch. Choso parried the blow and turned it back on her, twisting his sword down, around and up in what was now obviously a practised move. The branch was wrenched from her hand a second time. It clattered across the tiles and dropped over the edge, landing with a faint thud on the ground below. Kiri stepped back, almost losing her footing as she reached the edge of the guttering, her heel exposed above the drop. A tile cracked, and pieces of debris dropped into the street behind her. Kiri tensed, waiting to see what Choso was going to try next, concentrating on his shoulders. You could always see the strike coming if you paid attention. She saw a flicker of movement and leapt up the sloping roof. Choso had tried to chop at her legs, but she evaded the blow, the sword slamming into the tiled roof below her. Kiri landed further up and scrambled for a moment, one hand on the apex of the roof. Choso growled in fury and moved below her, ready to stab upwards. Now she was worse off, helpless as he approached. He was going to gut her right there. Kiri tried to prise her way upwards, aiming to gain the other side and escape Choso that way. Her feet struggled for grip on the smooth tiles. She couldn't get any purchase. They were slick with green. Choso laughed and ready to blow. She felt sweat drip down her face and her stomach clench. Kiri focused her attention on her precarious grip, staring at the curved tile grasped in her hand as if it was the only thing that existed in her world. Her fingers were slipping. "No, hold on, don't!" She looked back at Choso, rage and impotence boiling through her like a flood. For a moment their eyes met. A strange feeling rippled through her, a crisp metallic tang she could almost taste. Choso yelled and clutched at his head as if in sudden pain. He staggered, toppling over, smashing into the tiles which cracked and started sliding down the roof. Kiri felt the side of her body slam into the tiles as her feet completely lost grip. A moment later there was a sickening, sliding sensation as the tiles underneath her gave way, cascading rapidly down the roof. She scrabbled desperately for grip, hurtling down and yelling out in fear. She cannoned into Choso and knocked them both over the edge amidst a cloud of dust, broken tiles, dirt and fluffs of greening. She heard a yell as she flung out her hands, feeling her palms rip and tear as she tried to slow a descent. There was a heavy thump from somewhere below her. She held on, coming to an abrupt halt. Kiri blinked, trying to clear her eyes. For a moment she could see nothing but swirling dust which burned her eyes. The urge to rub them was intense, but she knew she didn't dare move. There was no sound but an unpleasant creaking from above her and the faint showering of dust and debris. For a moment she held still, her eyes stinging, feeling dust and dirt cascade around her. A brief glance confirmed she was hanging by the guttering at least 50 hands above the ground below. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her eyes. They watered, blurring her vision. She shook her head, feeling the fluid dripping down her cheeks. She looked up to see blood dripping down her outstretched arms from lacerations in her palms. Pain was intense, making her wince, but she clung on desperately. She looked down, trying to find something to brace her feet against. Unfortunately, the guttering overhung the wall of the house by some margin, and her feet couldn't reach anything. The guttering creaked again and shifted a finger's length, jolting her downwards and showering her with dust again. She looked up through watering eyes and saw the guttering breaking free from its supports. She struggled in vain for a moment and then felt herself falling, yelling out as she did so. She braced against the certain death she knew was coming, screaming out a defiance. Her breath was knocked out of her on impact, but it was not the hard, abrupt end she had expected. She hit something soft, heard a grunt, and then found herself on the ground, dazed and winded, but most definitely alive. "Caught the slum," somebody said above her. A blurred crowd of people were around her, pushing and shoving. She was wrestled roughly to her feet and pushed forward before she could see who they were. Folks must have been drawn to the ruckus. Ahead they were clustered around something on the ground. Before she could see what it was, she was pushed forward with enough force to throw her to the ground again. Her outstretched hands felt as if they were on fire. Half dazed from the pain, she raised her head to see blank eyes, already cloudy, staring sightlessly at her. It was Choso, lying on his back in the dirt. His mouth was open, a look of profound astonishment frozen on his face. A pool of murky, dark-red blood was oozing out from somewhere behind his head. Kiri had only a moment to grasp what had happened. "Snot and dirty slum!" She was unprepared for the kick that came out of nowhere into her stomach. She rolled onto her side, curling up in agony. Another kick caught her from behind in the kidneys, throwing her over in the opposite direction. She felt rather than heard a rib crack in her chest as further blows rained down upon her. One caught her in the head. She saw a brief burst of flickering lights before blackness claimed her vision. "Not here!" someone yelled. "Take her out into the lane and throw her in the woods." Kiri dimly felt her ankles being grabbed, and then she felt herself being carelessly hauled across the rough ground, the sharp edges of stones cutting into her back and arms. It seemed to last a lifetime, But she couldn't even cry out, the pain in her chest too extreme for her to do anything more than gasp for breath. The world spun away from her. A jolt in her arms and a heavy thud brought her back to consciousness. She drew a shuddering breath, but the pain was intense, her muscles spasming and causing her to shake uncontrollably. She tried to move, but she couldn't get her body to respond. The taste of blood was on her lips. One eye was already swollen shut, but she managed to open the other one. For a moment she could make no sense of what she was seeing. All she could make out were shoes. It took her a moment to realize she was still surrounded by a crowd of people. With faint amusement she recognized the wall behind them. She had climbed it just a few moments before. Dimly she saw a hand reach down, her vision blackening around the edges. She recognized the colour of the tunic on the arm, one of Choso's brothers. The hand grasped a smooth round rock from the edge of the lane and lifted it slowly out of her line of sight. She whimpered feebly. "I'll see you in the after soon, Tia." Nothing happened for a long moment. Then she heard another cracking sound. Pain registered in her leg, but it was nothing compared to the agony already burning through her. She heard the sounds of more stones being picked up, a rough scraping noise from all around her. Mutterings of assent and approval followed, quickly growing into a roar, like Khans baying for blood. Kiri's consciousness faded away as the next stone struck her supine body. There was a vague feeling of frustration, but it was swamped by anger and a sudden wrath that surged through her. Her last thought burnt through her mind. "I don't want to die." She felt the strange tang once again, metallic, almost like the blood she could taste in her mouth, but oh, so powerful. It was intoxicating, crackling through her whole self. She heard yells, and then exclamations of surprise, pain, and fear. Next came the sounds of stones being dropped, and feet hurriedly scuffling away. There was a rush of air, a thump of something heavy landing nearby. Kiri heard a deep snort and a throbbing intake of breath. "Hold!" The cry was imperious, firm, and stern. More words followed, but Kiri could not understand them. Their impact was immediate. The crowd became silent, and then rapidly dispersed. She saw feet running, raising a cloud of dust. She tried to turn her head to see, but found she couldn't move. Deliberate footsteps sounded, moving swiftly towards her prone form. She felt a hand push back the bloodied hair from her face, and then fingers placed against her neck. For the third time she felt the peculiar tang tingle through her, less intense this time, almost comforting. "Are you still alive? Can you hear me?" Kiri felt as if a strange musical voice had said the words inside her head. It was accompanied by a sense of astonishment, anger, abject concern, and a burning hope. "It's her," the voice said quietly. "Did you see what she did? A slum girl?" The second voice interrupted doubtfully, carrying an air of distaste. "Only those of high blood. We can't afford to lose any of them. You know that. Our numbers grow fewer every pass. She must be one. Is she alive?" "Barely. Be quick. Help me get her to the infirmary before it's too late." Kiri felt herself gently hoisted into the air, her body cradled in strong arms. Her broken ribs grated painfully and she yelped in pain. "Ugh! She's filthy and rank! Disgusting! Stop complaining and hurry!" Kiri's vision was a blur, but she caught sight of a startling cyan and magenta gown, shining in the sunlight. Just like the flit. Her working eye focused briefly. Her gaze travelled upwards to see a beautiful but ghostly pale face, a simple tiara perched on a high forehead with immaculate dark hair brushed to the left side, with a distinctive silver streak. She saw a sparkle of a thin triangular pendant. A priestess. She could just make out the dark form of an enormous dak behind the woman before she was turned around and hoisted up. Her stomach lurched and everything went blurred. There was a jolt and a rush of air. The ground fell away beneath her. The ground, the city wall, the streets, houses. Blackness abruptly engulfed her, and sound faded into utter silence.